Sagt die Gemara, Pigel bekoimet. We have to a new Mishnah on Daf Tazayin Amral. Pigel bekoimet v'loy b'levoina. What happens if somebody had kavana of pigel by the koimet? So Rashi back Taurus koimet chishev al sharaim. While he was being makir the koimets, which is a ko-avoida, because you have to be makir not only the koimets, but you have to be makir the levoina. And by the Taurus koimets, he had kavana that he was going to eat the shiraim chutz manai. V'loy b'levoina. But he didn't have kavana when he was makir the levoina. Or what about vice versa? B'levoina v'loy b'koyretz. This was a shayla we already discussed on Daf Yudalid, and it's called if you could be mefagel bechatzi koymetz or bechatzi avoida. So Reb Meir holds pigel v'chayov in the love chorus because you could be mefagel bechatzi avoida. V'chachamim ein by chorus achi yefagel b'chol hamatir. You have to have kavanah pigel side by the haktoris hakoymetz and side by the haktoris halavoina. Otherwise, it's not pigel. Umoidim chachamim Reb Meir, but the chachamim do agree to Reb Meir, and the Gemara questions. We had the Gemara already, which questions, what do you mean the chacham is moidi in this case? This is a completely different case where there's no chatzi matir. Umoidim chachamim Reb Meir b'minchas choyte b'minchas kanois, where there is no levaina, so there is no chatzi matir, and therefore it's going to be pigol. Shem pigol b'koimit show pigol v'chayovin olav kares. Why? Sha'koimit to a matir. So that's not a case of chatzi matir. So what shaykhus does it have? So the Gemara said, this is just to reveal to us what the svar of the chachamim is, and it's because they're geyser. It's because they're geyser. Atu a case where there was only the koimets and not the levaina. That's why they answer here, because it says chachamim ein by karis at yifagel, and the Gemara said, you see, you have arrived from here that the chachamim are geyser, even though it's not pigel, they're geyser because. Why are they geyser? That's exactly what they're telling us over here. They're geyser because if it was a minchas chayte without levaina, that would be a proper pigel. Okay, gewaltig. Shachat echad min hakvasim. We know by kivsei atzeres there's two matirim, and you shechted one of these two lechol beis chalois lemacher. So that's one example of chatzi matir. Another example of chatzi matir is there's two beziche levoina by the lechem aponim, and you only hit your echad mehen, echad min habezichen lechol beis sidor lemacher. That's another example of pigel b'chatzi matir. Reb Meir says pigel b'chayavin of cars, v'chachamim ein by cars achi yifagel b'chal matir. Once again, ein by cars, but it's still also because they're geyser. Shachat echad min hakvasim lechol mimenu lemacher. What if you shechted one of the kvasim to eat it tomorrow? So you're having kavana on the kvasim themselves while you're shechting this keves. You're having in mind to eat this keves. Chutz manai hu pigel v'chaver kosher, because on this keves it's the whole matir. Lechol mechaverei lemacher shneim ksherin. The Gemara wanted to know yesterday, what does chaverei mean over here? Does chaverei mean its friend, the other animal? Or does it, and therefore it's not pigel, or does it mean its friend, the breads, and then it will be totally in a shaila? So the Gemara is poishit. It says lecha mechaver lemocher shneim ksherim. From the fact that they're both kosher, it's a raya that stam mechaver means the other animal. The Gemara slugged up the raya by saying maybe when the Mishnah says lecha mechaver lemocher, it means and the person spoke out keves chaver. Right, that was the last thing we learned yesterday. Zog the Heilige Gemara. Amarav machloikis shenosan es hakoymet b'shtika v'yes halavoina b'machshava. The whole machloikis is when he put the koymetz on the mizbeach, he did not have a kavanah pigel. He only had a kavanah pigel later on when he did the second chatzi matir, the lavoina b'machshava. That's considered one avoida was done bekashrus, and the other avodah was done with the machshava pigel. That's precisely the subject of the Mishnah we just learned. But what about in the following case? First, the first thing he did is he placed the koymitz on the mizbeach with the machshava pigel. So he started with a machshava pigel. started right at the beginning of this process. But he mentioned nothing when he was maktir levayna. Divrei hakoil pigel. Rav holds it's pigel. You know why? Shekol ha'oisa al das rishayna ha'oisa. If when he starts off the Aktorah, he says, I'm doing this with a machshava of pigel to eat it chutz lezmanoi, if he doesn't correct that machshava, the assumption is that that machshava carries through for the rest of the avodah. So the assumption is that his Haktorah Shalavayna was also with the same machshava that he started with when he started with the Haktorah Shachavetz. Ushmul Amar no, Adain hu machlokes. You don't say Kol Ois al Das Rishayna hu Oisa. Every action that he does is independent. Just because he expressed the machshava of koimetz by the first Haktorah when he was makter the koimetz, who said that would have been his machshava when he's makter the levayna? So at the end of the day, that is the machlokes. It's not only relevant. In this case, this is one of the cases that it's relevant in, is when you're doing two avodas and you speak out your kavanah by the first avodah, do we say that automatically carries through until you correct it, or do we say each machshava, each ma'isa has its own machshava? Yosef Rava the Karmel al Hashmaitza. Rava said over this halacha of Rav and Shmuel, and when he said it, Eisvei Rab Acha by Rav Huna l'Rava. So Rab Acha by Rav Huna asked the kasha to Rava on Rav. B'mei devar mamurim, the Mishnah says, when do we say this halacha? What halacha? Zokt Rashi, the b'matona achas pigel b'domim. There's a case where if you only had kavanah by one of the matnas dam in a carbon, well, no, I'm jumping over. I'm sorry. B'medavar mum b'kmitza uv'matan kli. Did I skip or am I good over here? Good. B'medavar mum, where do we say that one of the avoiders alone will make pigol? That's b'kmitza, either by the kmitza, because there is no halacha of levayna by a kmitza. You don't make kmitza of the levayna. The matan kli, there's a mitzvah to put the koimitz into a keli. Again, that's not a ko-avoida because there is no such requirement relevant to the levayna. Ubehilach, and then to transport it to the mizbeach. Aval boloi la'aktorah, by the aktorah, that's when the levayna comes into play, because you have to be makter two things. Then nosen is a koimitz b'shtika v'es halavayna b'machshava, or as a koimitz b'machshava v'es halavayna b'shtika, you have your machlokes over here. Reb Meir Omer pigel b'chayovin olav karish v'chachamim orim ein b'karish achi yifakel b'chol matir. So we clearly see here there's a machlokes here, even though in the first part of the avodah he declared he's doing it with the machshava of pigel, and you don't say it automatically carries through. According to Rav, it automatically carries through, and it's as if he was mafagel the whole matir, side the kmitza that he did first, and side the levayna that he did second. Yet the Brisa disagrees. The Brisa says, even though the second one was b'shtika, there's still a machlokes. So clearly, you don't say Rav's halacha that since he did the avodah rishona with the machshava pigel, you say that's how he did everything. Exactly Rav's case, exactly where Rav said everybody would agree that this is all pigel, because this is not chatzi matir, this is the whole matir. Upligi, and you see there's a machlokes between Tanakama and Rebbeir even in this case. Zok to Gemara, maybe what it means is Ema uchavar nosan es halavoina b'shtika meikara. Maybe what it means is when the brisa that we just quoted says B'medavar mum b'kmita v'matan kliyu v'ilach avol ba loy lahaktara nosan es a koimetz b'shtika ves halavoina b'machshava or as a koimetz b'machshava ves halavoina and as a koimetz b'levana ves halavoina b'shtika, meaning as halavoina b'shtika meikara, the levana was put on b'shtika meikar, meaning both cases are really representing a case where the machshava of pigel only came in later after half the avodah was done. So that's where you'll say that it's half and half. Zok to Gemara, shtei tshuvas b'davar. There's two reasons why that wouldn't make sense to for taichet. So basically, what it would be saying is, clearly a case where the machshava psula only came in later. That's clearly a case of Chati Matir. and there's a komitz b'machshava, there's a levani b'shtika, doesn't mean the first komitz b'machshava, and then the levani b'shtika. It was just a komitz b'machshava, but beforehand it was the levani b'shtika. So basically, both cases are the same case. Sorry?
I thought the komitz is first. And then the
No, you could do each one. To be makter, you could be makter either one. Will be kosher. So at the end of the day, both cases are the case where the first avodah was b'shtika and the second avodah was b'machshava. Frank the Gemara state chuvas todover. Chada dehainu kamaitza. So then that's the same as the first case, right? We're trying to pick two cases: one where the shtika was first, one where the machshava was first. You're making both cases into the same case. Problem number one, v'yoid, and problem number two, hatani we learned. Achar kach. It says beferish. Achar kach. First you did the komitz b'machshava, and then the levoida b'shtika. Now it doesn't say that in this mission that we just quoted. We're bringing down another brisa that specifically says achar kach. So Zok Gemara, Tir Gemara, Chanina b'beis deyos. You're right. It's also a case where the first avoida was done b'machshava and the second avoida was done b'shtika. But Rav's halacha doesn't follow through on this particular case. Why? Because we're talking about two different people. If the same kohen that put the kmitz on the mizbeach with the machshava of pigel also put the levain on the mizbeach b'shtika, then you say he follows the machshava rishona kol ois al das rishona hu ois. But here what happened was you had one kohen put the kmitz on the mizbeach with a machshava of pigel. The second fellow, the person who did put the levain on, was a different person. He doesn't necessarily follow through the first person's machshava. And that's why there's a machlokes Rameir and Chachamim here, but Rav's halacha still stands. Gewaltig. Tashma. So let's try on another raya. We had a mission that says that even if you did one of the many matnas damim with the machshava of pigel, the whole thing is pigel. It's chatzi matir. The teretz is if it's one of the karbanos, which is the vast majority of karbanos, which are spritzt on mizbech achitzon, or where b'diavad, even one matnas dam would be adequate to fulfill the requirements of the carbon, so that would be considered the whole matir, and therefore if you had kavanah of pigel during that one matnas dam on the carbon that is normally spritzt b'mizbech achitzon, it will be pigel. But what about the karbanos that have multiple sets of matnas damim, like on Yom Kippur, or on the parim, like the par hal b'shol tzibur, the par kayim mashiach? Aval damim hanitnin al mizbech hapnimi, but damim that have matana on the mizbech hapnimi, where every single zrika is ma'akiv in those cases, kegoyin mem gimel shel yom kippurim. The par, the seer of Yom Kippurim require 43 zrikas. What are the 43 zrikas? Rashi actually lists them off. We had this before. Ches hazois, the par bein abadim. First there were 8 zrikas of dam bein abadim. Achas lamayla v'sheva lamata. So that's 8. Then you had another 8. V'ches the seir. So 8 plus 8 is 16. Uchenegdei behechal. And there was another 16 then in the hechal. Achas lamayla v'sheva lamata. So 16 plus 16 is 32. Now you have the 4 karnois hamizbech hapnimi. So 32 plus 4 is 36. And then vizayin al taharoi shal oisim mizbeach. And then they mixed the dam hapar and the dam here together. And they added another 7. So 36 plus 7 is 43. Right? The Gemara is going to say there'll be another shita who holds that it's actually more because they didn't mix the two damim together for the last 4. So instead of 43, it'll be 47. And the Gemara is even going to bring a shita who holds it's 48 because they held that the shvicha shirayim is also ma'akiv, so that would be 48. So we're starting here with 43. So Mamenu Amurim Kuay Mem Gimel Shem Kippurim. The achas esrei shel par kohen Mashiach, the achas shel par elam dosh tzibur. There were 11 zrikas. As Rashi says, 7 azois on the parachos and 4 on the mizbeach. So that's a total of 11. So if it's one of those where there's sets, right? There's sets. There's in the kodesh hakodeshim, there's in the heichal, there's on the mizbeach, there's on the karnos. So if you were mefagel in one of those sets, pigel, bein berishoina, bein b'shnia, ubein b'shlishis, Rab Meir Omer pigel b'chayav and of course, v'chachamim Omer ein beikars achi yifagel l'chol Matir. Once again, it's shver on Rav, because if you had a kavan of pigel by the first set, the Rav holds that kol oisa al das rishoina oisa. So once you had a machshava of pigel by the first set, unless you specifically state this is no longer pigel, by default you say that the whole thing was done with a pigel. So why is there a machlokes over here? So berishoina means the first one was b'machshava and the other ones were b'shtika. Upligi, and there's still a machlokes, and we don't say that as machshava of pigel automatically carries through the rest of the avodah. If you're going to tell me that this also means where there were two different kohanim, one was doing the first set of zrikas, one was doing the second set of zrikas, so one was doing the third. Why would another kohen take over? One kohen did the zrikas in the kodesh HaKodeshim. Why suddenly would someone take over when it comes to the heichal? The only way that would happen is if the dam spilled out and he ran out of dam. So therefore, you need to bring more dam. So you need to shecht a new animal, and then you spritz the rest of the dam in the heichal. But there's a machlokes. What happens if, in fact, after he does the zrikos in the kodesh HaKodeshim, if the dam spills out? One mandamar holds, you shecht another animal, and you pick up from where the other guy laid off. So you'll have one guy doing the zrika in the kodesh HaKodeshim, and you'll have another kohen gadol doing the zrika in the heichal. Now your territory works out perfectly. There's 2 days. The kohen in the kodesh HaKodeshim had a machshava pigel. The kohen in the heichal didn't. But if you hold a leman davar b'par v'lo b'damish par, meaning if the dam spills out after the zrikas in the kodesh HaKodeshim, you don't just bring another set of dam from another par and continue on where you left off. Everything has to be done with the same dam from the same par. So you got to start all over again. Meaning it's all going to be one. It's always only going to be one kohen who's spritzing the dam everywhere. According to him, how are you going to have shtei deos, which is how you want to explain this brisa? Michael Meimar, Amarava, Hachabamai Askinon, maybe the case was, Kagoin Shepigel Berishoina. So it says, Bein Berishoina, Bein Bishni, Bein Bishlishis, it means by the first set of Zrikos, he had Kavana, a pigel, Bishazak Bishnia, and he was quiet by the second set of avodas. So there, in such a case, if it all stopped there, then Rav would maintain that Kol Oisal Das Rishon Oisa. But the story didn't end there. Upigel B'Shlishis. By the third, he spoke out Pigel. So clearly, the Amri Isal Kadaita Kol Oisal Das Rishon Oisa Mihader Pigula B'Shlishis Lamali. The fact that the fellow spoke out by the third Zrika, he also has a machshav of Pigel. Doesn't that show that by the second Zrika he didn't? Because he spoke it out by the first, he spoke it out by the third, he didn't speak it out by the second. So that's the teretz why Rav's halacha of Kol Das Oisal Das Rishon Oisa doesn't apply here. But for Gemara, the teretz is not a good teretz because the Brisa doesn't say that. It says Bein B'Rishona, Bein B'Shni, Bein B'Shlishis, and you're timing. You need the whole set together to see what's going on. Matzka lo Rabashi Midi Shasa Katani. It says Bein B'Rishona, Bein B'Shni, Bein B'Shlishis. It doesn't say Chisha B'Rishona v'Shasik B'Shnia v'Chisha B'Shlishis. It doesn't say that. So you have a very nice narrative, but it's not what the Brisa is saying. Midi Shaza Katani, Elo Amr Ravashi, I'll tell you how you could answer this according to Rav. Hachabamai Askinon, Kagon Shepigel Berishoina, Ubishnia. He actually spoke out a machshav of Pigel by the first set of dam. He spoke out a machshav of Pigel by the second set of dam. But Uvishlishes, he didn't. So if you look at the base, I think the Uvishlishes is Shosak. The Shosak Uvishlishes. He didn't say anything but a third. The Amri will say, Isol Kedaitach, Kol Oisal Das Rishonahu Oisa, if you hold that Kol Oisal Das Rishonahu like Rav, it wouldn't apply here, because Mihader Pigule Bishnia Lamali. Here, by the second one he spoke it out, but not by the third. So clearly, there's a distinction over here. So clearly, normally you would say, Kol Oisal Das Rishonahu Oisa. But here the Kohen did it a little funny. He spoke it out by two, not by one. That clearly shows he only wants it by those two, not by the other one. Zok to Gemara, that doesn't either fit in so good. V'bein bein katani. Again, the Lashon of Bryce is if you had a machshava pigel by either one, the machshava achas v'loy b'shtayim. And you're telling me this only works if he had If he spoke up by 2, and that's the anomaly, and that's why you're saying the machshava of pigel carried through, but that's not the case. The case is bang bang, meaning even if you only had a machshava of pigel by 1, there's still going to be a shiloh, but according to Rav, if you had a machshava by 1, at least by the first, they should all be pigel. So we end up not accepting any of the terutzim on Rav. Zok to Gemara weiter. Then the Mefarshim speak out, these kashas that the Gemara asked challenge Rav Ashi, they challenge the terutzim. But Rav anyway is not Ogush Logan, because for Rav you could say that it's different Kayhanim, and you can hold that he holds like that Shita that you don't have to start from the beginning. You could start in the middle. So therefore, according to Rav itself, it wouldn't be sure. Okay, Amar. Let's go analyze what we learned until now. Rav Meir Omer Pigel v'Chayav l'Avkaris. Frankly, Gemara Michti. Let's think about this. You had a machshava of Pigel, let's say by the first set of domim when he was spritzing the dam by the Aron Kodesh of the first par. Let's say Michti. Karis loy mechayev. No, he won't be chayev karis for eating this carbon just because he spritzed with a machshava of karis, because he has to finish the avodah bekashrus. We know the rule by pigel is unless the rest of the avodah is pristine, the whole pigel doesn't work. So michni karis loy mechayev achi yikru kol matir. We know the entire sequence has to continue properly. The Amar Mar yeratzeh kartzos kosher. Right, that's an old rule we learned when it comes to pigel. Unless the whole halacha, the whole process follows through properly, the pigel doesn't answer. Kosher But here you have a problem because the zrika was disqualified in the middle of the zrika, because in the Kodesh HaKodeshim, the zrika was disqualified. He had a machshava of pigel. So the rest of the zrikas that he does, the moment he had a machshava of pigel, when he was spritzing the dam in the Kodesh HaKodeshim, the dam became possible. So kimadi behechel, when he now continues the second set of zrikas in the hechel, it's not dam anymore. Maya balmahu the kamadi. He's dam spritzing water because he already passed it. So the obvious question that jumps into your head is, I don't understand. When we say that by a case of pigel, the rest of the avodah has to be done pristine, it means nothing else can go wrong. We can't undo the machshava of pigel that already happened. In every scenario, there's going to be a machshava of pigel. L'mashal, he shechted a regular carbon shlomim with a machshava to eat it chutz l'zmanoi. You're not going to say now the kabbalah sadam and the zrika sadam is stam water. The shechita was already done b'psol. So for Rashi, I don't understand. In every other scenario with pigel, you isolate the machshava pigel on the shechita, but it doesn't automatically say that the carbon is possible, so that when you're mekabel dam, when you make the zrikas dam, it's maya ba'alma. So why over here do we disqualify the second set of zrika and the third set of zrika? If the whole problem was that the first set was the pigel, it has to be pristine except for the machshava pigel that happened already. So Zok Rashi, there's a very fundamental difference. The fundamental difference is by the case of you had kavanah pigel by shchita, the shchita avodah is completely finished. The next avodah of Kabbalah and Eilacha are completely different avodas. But here, all of the sets of zrikas, we don't look at them as multiple zrikas. We look at it as one big avodah. Within one avodah, if it became possible, that will be a problem. Now let's see Rashi on the first skinny line. Vikasha bekomitz v'shoichet nami lema d'lema fagel. The chichashiv, once you had kavanah of pigel at the beginning, if so, now the whole carbon is possible. So kizark, when you spritz the blood now, it's already pigel. Maya balmazar. Zok Rashi lav pirchi. It's not a kasha. Tahasam oisa avoida shepigel ba nasas kula b'ktushasa. The whole avoida of shchita was done b'ktushasa. Now we're talking about a new avoida. That's where you don't discount it with the pigel from the first avoida. Aval hana chazois chad avoida. In middle of the avoida got disqualified, so the rest of the avoida of this same avoida of zrikas adam is possible. So Zok Gemara, how would that work? On Merabah, it's not a problem. Mishkachas la ba'arba porim ba'arba seirim. You know what could happen? If the dam got spilled out after he had the machshava pigel, what do you have to do? You got to start over again. and you continue on from where you left off. So therefore, every time you start with a new one, the new animal that you shechted is not pigel. So what happened was, he had a machshava pigel by the first set of azois, and then the rest of the dam spilled out. You have to bring a new animal. The new animal there's no machshava pigel on, so now you can pigel and have a machshava pigel. Rav Amar afilu tema par echad usir echad lefegule meratzi. That we say that the rest of the carbon has to be done kashrus, that excludes the problem of pigel because that's built in. So even if it's the same avoida, the fact that it became pigel, that's not going to disqualify the carbon from becoming pigel. It has to be a different soul. Let's go count. Let's do accounting. Arboim v'sholosh. You said that by the Purim of Yom Kippur there were 43 matanas. I vatanya arboim v'sheva. We learned there were 47. So tomorrow like Asha, hakaman damer ma'arvin lakarnos, hakaman damer ein ma'arvin lakarnos. If you didn't mix the blood of the seer and the dam of the par to spritz on the 4 karnos of the mizbech hapnimi, so there's an extra 4 azois. 43 plus 4 is 47. There's another brayso that says 48. There is a machlokes whether after you finish all of the azois of these karbanos, if there's a chiyuv, the devil is a chiyuv to pour the rest of the blood on the yisoid of mizbech hachitzon. The question is if that's ma'akiv the whole avodah. If it's ma'akiv the whole avodah, that's one of the matanos. That would be a sum total of 48. Iboilu pigul b'hilocha ma'u. What if we did pigul by locha? Now, why is halacha unique? By kmitza, there's for sure no din of a co-heter of doing the levina because levina doesn't need kmitza. Putting it into a klisharis, that's only a requirement, but a kmitza, not by the levina. So that we know for sure there's no co-conspirator, there's no co-matir. Placing it on the mizbeach, we know for sure there is a because just like you have to place the kmitza on the mizbeach, you have to place the levina on the mizbeach. But what about the transporting of the kaimates from the place of the kmitza until the place of the mizbeach? Technically, you have to transport the levina as well. It's got to get there. So, Frek the Gemara as follows: Pigul by lachamau. Rabbi Yochanan halachas k'kmitza. That's part of the kmitza process. That would not be considered a kol matir. Meaning, v'yat kavana of pigul during the halacha, the whole carbon is puzzle, and you don't say it's chatzi matir. For Shlok Omer, no. Halach is kak-haktara. It's part of the Aktara because it's something that's necessary to facilitate the Aktara, and therefore, if you had Kavana of Pigel when you were only Moilach, either the Levina or the Kaimates, it would not be Mefagel according to Rabbanon because there's Ein Pigel B'Chatimat. Zokamar Bishlam Rish Lakish. Rish Lakish makes sense. Technically, you do got to move the Levina from point A to point B. So why wouldn't that be Halacha? Economic Halacha to Levina. Why is he discounting that? Why doesn't he consider that part of the process? My time, Omerava, because Rabbi Yochanan kol avoda she'ena materes avoda chashuvahi lefagal Allah b'fnei atzma. If it's an avoda that's being matir, such as the haktorah is being matir the shirayim, so there, if the same process is required on something else, so the haktorah is required by the levina and the haktorah is required on the mitzvah, so there it's only considered a chatzi matir, because the whole thing is a matir, half of it is a chatzi matir. But if there's an avoida that's not matir anyway, it's like a preparatory stage, such as the halacha, this whole rule doesn't apply. So it's an avoida that's in a materis, that means each one independently will be able to be mafagel. Okay, Amr Abaye challenges this svara that Rava said. Harei shchitas echad min hakvasim, the avoida she'ein matirasa. When you shecht each of the two kvasim, there we all agree that was a case of chatzi matir. But technically, Rava, based on what you're saying, shchitas hakvasim isn't matir anything at all. So since it's not matir anything at all, upligi yet there's still a machlokes. That nan shachad echad min hakvasim lechol shtei chalois l'macher, or hikter echad min hamazichen lechol shnei storm l'macher. Reb Meir bar pigel b'chiyavin l'karis v'achamim amim ein b'karis ad she'yifagel b'chol matir. But if you hold Rava that if it's a stage, if it's an avodah that's not matir, and in this case the shchita is not matir anything, it's the zrika that's matir. So if it's the zrika that's matir, the shchita is not matir. So why isn't the kavan of pigel by shechting one of the kvasim? Why isn't that enough to be mafagel? Amar lei, Rava answered Mi Savris Lechem Betaner Kadosh. Who said the Shechita doesn't do anything? You know why you think the Shechita doesn't do anything? Because you think the moment they bake the Shtei Lechem, that gives it the Kedushas Aguf. No. You know when the Shtei Lechem take on Kedushas Aguf? Shchitas Kavosim Mikachele. The Shchitas of the Kavosim, that's what makes the Shtei Lechem into a Kedushas Aguf. You're going to ask me, we're talking about Matir, not Makdish, so who cares if the Shchita is Makadish? But Vabola Kadesh, Kabbalah Hatir Dami. Yes, since it has a profound impact, the Shchita, because the Shchita makes the bread into Kedushas Aguf, we consider that also a Matir, and therefore, by the Shchita Shnei Kvasim, there'll also be a problem of Chatzi Matir, because it is a Matir, that's what gives the breads their Kedushas Aguf. Mazav Rab Shimi bar Ashi. Acher Moimer. There are those who say, Acher means Rameir. Hikdim mulim la'arelim. Now the halacha is, when you shech the Korban Pesach, you have to shech it for people who are kosher to eat it. So what happens if, at the beginning of the Shechita, he had Kavanah, so by the Siman Rishon, he had Kavanah, he's shechting it for mulim, for those people who are allowed to have the Korban Pesach, a perfect Kavanah. And then, by the second siman, he had in mind that he's shechting it off la'arelim. He's also including arelim in it. The halach is kosher, that's a kosher carbon. But what happens if hikdim arelim lemulim? The first siman he had kavana only for arelim. That's going to be possible. It's not a good shechita if you're shechting for arelim. So then it's going to be possible. The kaim alon and the machlokes as to whether or not this would be possible, the Gemara explains, is the bechatzi mater pligi. They're arguing if you could passel a carbon bechatzi mater, because what was if the hikdim arelim lemulim, only one siman, which is a chatzi matir, had the bad kavana. Who said if you have a bad kavana by the chatzi matir it'll work? So the machlokes gufa is, could you passel the carbon bechatzi matir, very similar to, or almost identical to our shaila? It's just that the our shaila has two impacts now. It has impact l'gabe pigel, but it also has an impact l'gabe a different type of bad kavana when you have kavana to shech the Korban Pesach for the wrong people. So oy bazoi, it's going to be shver over here, because again the shchitas hakarban by the Korban Pesach bishlam about the shtei lechem. You said that the shchita is makdish the shtei lechem with kedusha, so it counts as a matir. But shechting the Korban Pesach doesn't do anything. It's not matir anything. It's the zrikas adam that's the matir. So oy bazoi, why would there be a problem of chatzi matir? Omerlei, so he answered back, mi sovers dam b'tzaver behema kadosh. What do you think qualifies the dam to be able to be spritzed? It's not just because it happens to be there. Dam sakin mekachale. You know what gives the dam a status of dam luzrika? The shchita itself. So therefore the shchita is a matir, and therefore there is an issue of chatzi matir. Tashma. Where do we say that these are exclusive avodas that apply to the kmitza only, and there will be no issue of chatzi matir? That's the kmitza, the matan kli, and the hiluch. So, freik the Gemara, my love, hiluch daktorah. The hiluch that we're talking about is transporting the koimitz from the makam kmitza, from where the mincha basket was, to the mizbech. Well, isn't that also required to be done by the Levine as well? And therefore it'll be shvei Rabbi Yochanan, because Rabbi Yochanan says that only applies to kmitza. So my love hiluch dak Torah. I'm sorry. Then you have a raya that against Rish Lakish, that the hiluch only applies to the kmitza, not to the Levine. So that's not a hiluch that's exclusive. The hiluch that's exclusive to the kmitza is hiluch the matan kli, is moving the kmitza after you made the kmitza to get it into the keli. So we're talking about a hiluch that happens before the matan kli. Frank Gemara, but that's not in order. The Brisa lists off hiluch after the matan kli. So if it's the hiluch to put it into the keli, it should have been listed first. It should have said b'kmitza ubehiluch ubematan kli. Yachi b'matan kli ubehiluch. It should have said behiluch ubematan kli b'boilei. If we're talking about the hiluch that applies exclusively to the kaimes. Zog to Gemara, holoi kasha. That's not shver. Tiniyachi, say that. Frank Gemara, okay, but let's go to the next line in the Brisa. The next line in the Brisa is, after the kmitza b'matan kli b'hiluch, boloi la'aktara, when you approach the aktara, that's when there's co-matirin, that's where you have the problem of there's a haktar required for the levaina and there is a haktar required for the chaymitz. It shouldn't say that because the next step after the nesinas hakaymitz bechli is now transporting it to the mizbeach. That halacha, according to Rish Lakish, you agree that there's a dual halacha. There's a halacha for the kmitza and there's a halacha for the levaina. So how come the Brisa doesn't say that? So Mahalakasha, kiven the halacha tzarich the haktarahi. Why are you being moilechit? It's practical to be able to be maktir it. So we call it haktara, korele haktara. So when the Brisa says baloi lahaktara, it means baloi to that stage, but avada it means the halacha towards the haktara. Ella noson es hakaymetz b'shtika. Once again, when the Brisa describes a case of Chatzi Matir, the Brisa talks about placing the kaimitz on the mizbech b'shtika and the levaina with a machshava of pigel. That was a case of Chatzi Matir. Hoylech miboyle. According to you, Rish Lakish, even the halacha should have been listed off as an opportunity to have had Chatzi Matir. Why does the Brisa only express a possibility of Chatzi Matir by that Torah? So that'll be sure. Hikter shumshum lechol what does the Bach say? Lechol lemachar shumshum at shekala kaimitz kula. Instead of being makter a full kaimitz at a time on the mizbeach with kavana to eat a full kizayis of the shiraim lemachar, he was makter the kaimitz in tiny little bits and pieces. So he took a tiny little bit of the kaimitz, placed it on the mizbeach, and he had kavana that he's going to eat a tiny little bit of the shirayim chutz lezmanai, and he did it piecemeal. So instead of being makter the whole kmitza at a time, he was makter the kmitza in little bits and pieces. So do you say that's one big kmitza or not? There's a three-way machlokes. Chadam or pigel. One says it's pigel. This is a regular haktara, so he did it little by little, but we look at it as a regular haktara with a regular machshava pigel. The chadam or posel. One says it's not pigel, it's only posel midarabanan. The chadam or it's kosher and ganzen. Frekt Gemara, let's suggest that it's totally in a three-way machlokes. Lema mandam or pigel chozak Rameir. This is technically a Chatzi Matir. He's doing a little bit at a time, but Rameir holds befaglim a Chatzi Matir. Mandam or posel rabbanon. The man holds the posel that rabbanon who holds ema faglim a Chatzi Matir, but midarabanan we aser. Mandam or kosher will be going like Rebbe, who said, if you remember, Rebbe said, if you shechted one keves, amonas to eat half a gazayis of bread A, and another keves, amonas to eat a half a gazayis of bread B, he held was kosher and ganzen, you don't even have exera, it's Chatzi Matir. It's Chatzi Oichel and Chatzi Matir. Zok Gemara Mimai. Who said we should make this into a three-way machlokes, the existing machlokes today? Maybe not. Dilma Atkan like come Reb Meir Hasam. Where did Reb Meir say that there's no problem of Chatzi Matir? Ela de Chishev B'Shiurai. The machshava that he had was on a full shear. What was the case of Reb Meir? He did a full kmitza, and while he did a full kmitza, he had kavanah to eat a full kazayis of the shirayim. I didn't think about the levaina. True, but in the kmitza it was a full kmitza. Here he didn't even have kavanah. The avodah is a little bit. It's not even a full kmitza, and he's only thinking about eating a little bit. Maybe even Reb Meir would be moida that wouldn't be a proper pigel. V'yakan lo kami Rabbanan awesome, and even the Rabbanan said el lechashiv bei bechuli matir. In the case where Rabbanan argue on Reb Meir, what was the case? Where he's makir the kaimitz and not the levaina with a machshav of pigel. So he didn't have kavanah at the end of the day on the full matir. He only had kavanah pigel by the kmitza or by the levaina, but not by both. Avalocha here, lemais at the end of the day, the chishe ve'bechule matter. At the end of the day, he had a kavanah of pigel during the entire kmitza. He just did it in little bits and pieces. But at the end of the day, he had a full machshava of pigel. So maybe hachanami the pogel. Maybe Rabbanan in this case would hold that it's not chatzi matter, and it is going to be pigel deraisa. The Akan like Rebbe who hasam, even Rebbe who was matter el lehader malya mayos avoda. What was the case? By kevasei he had kavanah to eat a chatzi gizais of bread B, but he never finished the kavanah. He never said later on, I'm on the same kevis. I'm also going to do the other half of gizais. In other words, the sum total of what he did was only a half of a kazayis per one kevis. He never finished the deal. Sure, each little bit that he was making kaimitza on wasn't a full kmitza, but at the end of the day, there was a full kmitza and there was a full shir achila. So maybe Rabbi would be moida hachanami the apostle. So therefore, the machloikis, the three-way machloikis between Reb Meir, Chacham, and Rebbe have no impact, no bearing on the discussion over here. Rather, this is a completely independent discussion. Elamadamer pigol divrei hakoil. The Mandama holds that this case is pigol will fit in Sai according to Reb Meir, Sai according to Rabbanan, Sai according to Rebbe. Mandama posel divrei hakoil, Mandama kosher divrei hakoil. And now we'll go break it down. Mandama pigol divrei hakoil. You know why everybody would agree that in this case where he was makter a little bit of the kmitza at a time until he finished all kmitza, that it will be pigol? Because kasavar derech achila b'kach. It's normal to eat a little at a time. So it's considered a kazayis. We look at it that he had kavana on a full kazayis to eat it chutz l'zmanoi, because it's normal to be able to eat it little by little, even if kavana little by little. And v'derech haktor b'kach. It's a normal haktorah, even though you're not being makter a full kaimitz at a time, you're doing a little bit at a time, that's a haktorah. So there's a full haktorah as far as we're concerned, and there's a full kavana of eating a full kazayis of the shiraim chutz l'zmanoi. That's pigol deraisa. Madam apostle, divrei hakoil, everybody would agree, kasavar, that derech achila b'kach, it is an achila. It would be a machshava of pigol. The problem is, vein derech haktorah b'kach. This is not a good haktorah. Haktorah means you put the whole kaimitz on the mizbech at once. Putting a little bit at a time, there's no kmitza here. So you know why it's puzzle? Nothing to do with pigol. It's puzzle because you never made a proper kmitza. So you have a carbon mincha that you never made a proper kmitza on. That's why it's puzzle. Va'avalei kamincha shalei huktorah. It's like a mincha that was never a haktorah made. Umandamar kosher, and the mandamar in this case all is kosher. Divrei hakoil, according to everybody, kasavar derech haktorah b'kach. This is a good haktorah, but vein derech achila b'kach. So it's a perfectly good kmitza without a good machshav of pigol, so it's a perfectly good carbon. Okay, we'll stop here. I'll have to compromise on one word to leave for tomorrow. I'm sorry that I was so late today.